Our first film we're talking about this week is A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan biopic by James Mangold. A look at two key moments in Dylan's early creative life, his birth as an artist with his very opening albums and his emergence onto the scene, and then later in his life at his first real reinvention, Going Electric, which is the book that this film is closely based on. Obviously, this film stars very famous people. Timothée Chalamet, Ed Norton take very leading roles of established real-life people, Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger, respectively, but also for more up-and-coming actors like Monica Barbaro, who plays Joan Baez, and of course, Elle Fanning makes an appearance as well. This film is tipped for Oscars, as most of these biopics often do. And I must say, I think relatively unfairly, not that the film was bad in any way, but does it deserve the upper echelon of Hollywood recognition? I'm not sure, but instead, I'm going to ask my esteemed colleague what he thought. So, Reuben, what did you think of this film before I start doing my terrible Bob Dylan impression all the way through this?
Well, I'd sort of like to hear your Bob Dylan impression and see if it's worse than Timothée Chalamet's, because I think to get right to the heart of what I felt about this film, I didn't believe that he was Bob Dylan. I felt like I was watching a tribute act, and to be honest, a bit of an annoying one. I found the sort of the pose, the stylings, the voice very, very affected. It didn't feel authentic to me, and I don't think that he should win Best Actor at the Oscars. I know he's currently the second favourite at the bookies. I just don't think that it's a particularly good performance. I don't think that's necessarily Timothée Chalamet's fault, because I think the script actually gives him very little to work with. James Mangold has talked about the fact that, this is basically about the period of Bob Dylan's life where he was in the folk music scene and he was kind of a folk musician, and basically exploits that scene in order to become a big deal. And that extends to the relationships he has with, for example, Ed Norton's character, and with Monica Barbaro's character also. So I found it kind of a hollow watching experience, honestly. I liked the music. I was tapping my toe along. I think, the rendition of those songs is broadly good. I think that in song, Timothée Chalamet gets away with the voice a little bit more, because I don't expect it to sound like Bob Dylan. I like the fact that they didn't blend vocals. They went with a lot of live recorded on-set performances that he did. And every single song that you hear in this film, it is Timothée Chalamet alone singing. And the credits make that very clear. They say all vocal performances by Timothée Chalamet. But I just didn't care about his character. I think it's an interesting take, I suppose, to basically, frame the hero of your story as a bit of a conniving, selfish guy. I just watched the film and thought, yeah, you're right. He's using Elle Fanning. He's using Ed Norton. He's using the folk music scene. He thinks he's really, really cool. Everything is incredibly easy for him because everybody looks at him for 5 seconds and recognizes he's a genius. And then he has a great reinvention of himself after a slightly turbulent set. I mean, I didn't think this was a particularly interesting story, honestly. I think you could have framed it in a more dynamic way with a bit more acknowledgement of the fact that Bob Dylan is frankly very unlikable for the entirety of this film and learns nothing. There's no arc to his character, in my opinion. But they've I think gone with a really, really kind of conventional and quite unimaginative, quite unexplorative take on this character, and I didn't love it. I mean, it's really, really well made. James Mangold is a brilliant, brilliant filmmaker. He's got a great back catalogue as James Mangold, and this completely, I think, continues him, showing that he's a filmmaker who can make anything look really good, sound really good, be interestingly shot. I'm not criticizing any of the kind of technical elements of this. I just think that this isn't a very interesting story. It's all about the silhouette at the end. We don't learn anything about Bob Dylan. We just learn, wow, he's a genius, and that's what he looks like.
I completely agree. I find Timothée Chalamet's impression, I wouldn't say it's a performance. I didn't believe for once that he was Bob Dylan, like you said. I think the voice is, in a way, it is like an SNL portrayal of Bob Dylan. I think it's the worst when he's trying to do the Bob Dylan aphorisms, when he says these slightly mysterious, poetic things, especially when he first talks about Joan Baez. I thought she was pretty, but the blue eyes, I didn't like that. It's very much it's that. It's terrible. And with the singing, I think Bob Dylan's an interesting artist to do because you don't have to be a great singer to imitate the Dylan voice because Bob Dylan famously is a wordsmith and a poet, and a lot of people would not put him as a singer first. But I think they may have lent into that aspect too carelessly because when you listen to early Dylan, there's a warmth to his voice, like a genuine warmth, and it sounds like his voice when he sings. And I know that sounds like a rather stupid thing to say, but it is owned by him. Whereas Timothée Chalamet seems very, very strained when he's singing,
Yeah.
very strained. And I find that that isn't a reflection. Yes, okay, Bob Dylan's strange, but much later in his career, it actually got a bit more sonorous in the early years. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, as most aspiring musicians often are. I found it relatively disappointing. It was like posturing, as you said. And I found that there were much greater performances, both vocally and as a character. In Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez was my absolute favorite. I thought she sounded like sonically like an angel. To me, it should have been in the film 10 times more. And forgive me, I'm forgetting the actor's name, a frequent Mangold collaborator, but the Johnny Cash was maybe even better than Joaquin Phoenix's in the presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. And not only looks like Johnny Cash, but also sounds and the mannerisms are much better. Boyd Holbrook, I'm being told by my earpiece. Again, another key player. Ed Norton, I thought was very good as Pete Seeger. I thought he provided a warmth that often I don't feel you can attribute to Ed Norton. He often plays slightly more grey area characters. However, Pete Seeger is very much an American icon and warm soul. And I thought it was actually a really nice change of pace for him because he was actually a good presence on screen. And to be honest, when they all sat together and whenever music was playing, even though I'm not a huge fan of Timothée's rendition of Bob Dylan's voice, I actually thought that's when the movie really worked, is that the actual appreciation of these iconic songs. Every one of these biopics, you're just reminded how many great songs these artists do have. But it sort of lacks in the sense that this is just a biopic. This is like Walk the Line, but you don't have that central chemistry between Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon. You sort of lack that because Timothée's doing his very concerted effort to be Bob Dylan, but failing, missing the wood for the trees, missing the human behind the sunglasses. And I really think that it also is reflected in the stock character of Sylvie Russo that is played by Elle Fanning, who has nothing to do except do the typical, you need to do better, you need to be the voice of a generation, I'm your miserable first wife or first girlfriend. We had the same in all these films. There's always the miserable first. The Dewey Cox story told it well. The first embittered lover of this character who just gets broken and abused by them and is treated as such. And I believe is only present in the film because she really doesn't provide anything except a push. And the actual person is famously on Bob Dylan's first album cover, which they had to recreate in this film. Anyway, yeah, so those are just some of my thoughts. It's quite a hard movie to talk about in great depth because it's absolutely fine. I think people will enjoy it, but it has some humor. It has some good performances, but it's nowhere near. I don't think it's even on the same conversation as Walk the Line, let alone any of the more interesting biopics we've had more recently. But yeah, so it is quite hard to say more about it.
No, but you're right, because so much of, I think, the way that I watched this was informed by the fact that I'm familiar with the genre of musical biopics. And I do think that there's truth in the idea that if you're going to tell an extraordinary musician's life story, you probably should do it in a more unconventional way than this. If you look at something like Rocket Man, which is, a completely kind of hallucinatory psychedelic trip with all singing, all dancing, proper musical sequences throughout. Or indeed, the Robbie Williams biopic that's just come out, in which he is portrayed as a chimpanzee. That, I think, is a more interesting way of telling the Bob Dylan story. And of course, we kind of have that because we have the Todd Haynes' film I'm Not There, which I haven't seen, but I understand that tells the story of Bob Dylan sort of essentially through metaphor and via like 10 different actors playing essentially the role of Bob Dylan. So it's really, I think, just a bit frustrating to watch A Complete Unknown and think, yeah, there's a lot of good to be said about this film, but the overall product is less than the sum of its parts. I didn't at any point in this feel that the soul of Bob Dylan was anywhere near Timothée Chalamet. I think that's such a missed opportunity because he's a brilliant actor. He's really, really brilliant. James Mangold is great, and they could have made a much, much more interesting Bob Dylan biopic than this because he's a fascinating guy. It's a fascinating story. It's a shame to tell it in such a perfunctory way.
I think there's something to be said about how they chose to present it because they were really fixating on the going electric part of the Bob Dylan story, which is really quite early in his career, like 2 or 3 years after his very first album, you know. But I think it's interesting that they still chose to do the very beginnings. And I think the film would have done better if you just focused on the going electric part and really developed these characters and not had to shoehorn in the creation of the Bob Dylan myth, which is skirted over very casually in a way. Like a lot of these things are, you see him write a little bit, write his lyrics, but you don't really understand why he writes his songs. And Bob Dylan is a mystery. And I think what the Todd Haynes film does better is that it separates it. A human being is not just a series of events. They're a series of emotions. And a lot of times in these types of biopics, you get away with it because the songs tell the emotion. But we're so attached to these songs already. They're so ingrained in the lexicon that it's shorthand. It's kind of cheating. You are forced into it because you're like, oh my gosh, Blowing in the Wind, that's a song that resonates with me, or The Times Are Changing, or Mr. Tambourine Man, all these amazing pieces of music. And, you know, okay, fair dues to this film. I went back to listen to more Dylan after it because I'm like, I actually want to hear what the guy sounds like, but also really resonate with these amazing lyrics more than anything else. I find that such an interesting thing. You need to actually, going forward, Rocket Man was a really good examination of what Elton John is as a person. But then when it came to actually talking about the severity, you know, his closetedness and all this stuff, it took it very seriously. And therefore, the juxtaposition really accentuated that point. Another great biopic, I always talk about this when talking about it, Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson biopic, took two key moments of his life and explored them thoroughly with two different actors. One who was doing a very good rendition of what Brian Wilson was. Like Paul Dano's is very accurate, but very emotional as well. But John Cusack's is far more, it's just an actor performing as a character, as a human being, not necessarily recreating Brian Wilson to a T, but doing a wonderful job of representing what and who he is. And that's the thing that I think they were so concerned with, the aesthetic and the vocal presentation of Bob Dylan, that they didn't actually get the point that these films, this is a human being you're dealing with. Even though they are mystical and mythic and mysterious, you have to peel back those layers. And you're right, it just presented Bob Dylan as an arsehole. It didn't even capture the genius angle of it very spectacularly because it's so rushed, because you're trying to fit in so much. I think if you want to redo this film, you just focus on that one festival, film it over the day, figure out what Bob Dylan's feeling, why he wants to change, why he wants to go against these people. Because if the times are changing for Bob Dylan, we want to really understand why. But this film, it's a bit of a fart blowing in the wind. It won't last long. People will forget about it. They'll say, oh, yeah, Timothée, he did his performance, and then he's going to go on to great things, as I know he will. But it's a big no-go for me, this film.
Yeah, I do agree. And for my money, I think that if you want to see a film about Bob Dylan being a weird genius and kind of, you know, getting a bit of insight into his brain, then I really recommend that you check out the film on Netflix. It's called The Greatest Night in Pop, and it's about the recording of We Are the World. And the stuff with Dylan in that is absolutely fascinating because he's such a weirdo. You know, he's so out of place, he's so stressed out. The world's greatest singers are all there collaborating on this song, and he does not know what his place in it is. And he's vulnerable, and he's brilliant, and he's interesting, and his friendship with Stevie Wonder is incredible. Like, Stevie Wonder sings to him his own part in the style of Bob Dylan. Like it's really brilliant and it's really fascinating. And I wish that A Complete Unknown had captured an ounce of that magic. But for me, I completely agree with you. A Fart Blowing in the Wind is brilliant, and it's that silhouette, I think, that the film keeps giving us, keeps coming back to. It's iconic. It's recognisable as Bob Dylan, but there's no detail, and we have no sense of who the man himself is.